Hey, it's Soul, and welcome back to Warcraft Weekly, the show for the uncommon shill. Hit that like button, subscribe to game that YouTube algorithm, and let's jump into that pool of news, although that pool is sort of empty, I guess. Yeah. So how light is this week's news? Well, we did have a PTR build drop, and in it, the Enlightened Tabard, that thing that doesn't look so great, well, it got fixed from having that janky gap from before we could transmog our belts off to, hey, it's the 2020s, let's throw something over it and call it a day. I find that to be very on brand. Real talk though, I think this fix pretty much works. Like, it's meant to be a tabard with some, rag things over it. It's got that vibe of, yeah, I'm gonna represent my tribe or whatever, but this desert wind, it is rough on the skin. So here, like, throw something over it. Now, if they can go back and throw something on all the previous tabard gaps, that would be fantastic. Now, I know that the WoW team has said time and time again that they're not really interested in editing old assets and they'd rather work on new ones. That's fair. I'd like to think, though, that tabards can be an exception. I mean, there's only so many of them. They're all iconic with their representation. But what about... I said all of them. Iconic, right? Okay, maybe to like different degrees, I'll give you that. But if they just did the Tabard of the Shattered Sun, I'd be okay with that. Moving on, the Blizzard job site has posted some openings, one of which seems to be a new role, a narrative director specifically for the World of Warcraft. Now, in case you need some reassurance, this is a person for the likes of Steve Denuser to report to. This is going to be his boss, but this role isn't likely to be that of a unilateral decision maker kind of person like Alex Afrasiabi, who was like, hey, Sylvanas is going to burn Teldrassil down because I said so. And then after he got canned, the team was sort of left picking up the pieces. That at least is the prevailing story. The vibe that I get these days is that the overall story is more or less a collaborative effort, but my opinion, it could use someone who can look at the big picture and prioritize. The narrative director will be the person who would take a story like Battle for Azeroth and segment it in a way that you still won't like, but it's gonna flow and make sense and you still won't like it. So this is me trying to demonstrate my understanding here. Like, there'd be a decision maker who would be like, okay, we need to have Sylvanas monologues in between some of these story bits. They got to be peppered in there, and maybe we want to add elements to the Horde Council because, well, they needed some sort of better lead up. Speaking of Alex, his former role was that of creative director, who's the person in charge of the whole shebang. That is also an available role up on the job site, being in charge of, well, bringing it all together. Story, art, and cinematics. They're going to write off on whether this character is going to be relevant during Dragonflight, hopefully ensure that they'll have a better role than Bolvar did in Shadowlands, and I don't know, put him on a lunchbox for all we know. And this person's boss is the executive producer of World of Warcraft, recently promoted Holly Longdale. A big shift in this part of leadership over just a few months suggests what could be a dramatic shift for World of Warcraft in the future. But dramatic is kind of a strong word, right? Talking about these moves and openings isn't all that different from sports ball teams drafting and changing their lineups, and in that same vein, we're probably not going to see actual results from, well, any of these field positions until at least a year afterwards, so don't worry about hopping off the Denuser train just yet. Dragonflight is probably already mapped out in almost its entirety. We're going to see what happens when we get a more or less fresh story without the Sylvanas baggage, with a pandemic already part of the production schedule, but without a person to directly oversee it. At least that's the perception that I have. But now, I want to hear yours. What are your takes on this? Moving on, a number of you might have noticed your add-ons are no longer working right, as the battle for top add-on manager continues, as Overwolf, the company behind CurseForge, followed through with its plans and has cut off other add-on managers, including popular manager Wowup, from its repository. Some call it Overwolf trying to monopolize on add-on availability, while others would say Overwolf is just fully controlling what has been their storage and their bandwidth in the first place. In a surprise move, though, Overwolf released a standalone version of the CurseForge client, something that users have been clamoring for since the announcement that Curse would be acquired from Twitch, which, yeah, that's not a typo. I installed the standalone alpha client with no muss or fuss, and so far, no problems. Skeptical data miners and the people of Reddit have also looked into it, and while this client is in an alpha state where anything could be added later, so far the standalone version seems pretty benign. It's worth pointing out that while other add-on managers have existed and continue to exist, CurseForge is easily the biggest, but it hasn't had its own standalone client since 2016, when it merged with the Twitch desktop client, which has since been shut down about a month ago. The standalone client seems designed to run the same way as the one attached to Overwolf, so the way I see it, unless you play other games that use add-ons that can be installed using this Overwolf doohickey, just use the standalone instead. As I've said many times before, my personal stance is to take the side of creators, who are free to distribute their add-ons however the hell they please, just as we are free to download where and however we like. I'd say that Wowup's biggest advantage is that it allows you to download and update add-ons directly from the creator's website or GitHub if they want you to. You just need to manually set up each one. The biggest downside, though, is that it's just not nearly as popular of a host, and I like being able to just find stuff. Like, I could click on the option to add Wago and access add-ons hosted there, but the selection is way more limited, and in a very weird way, I don't put a lot of trust into the ad network partnership with Wago because they're not a highly scrutinized company with a bad reputation with people looking for evidence to drag them down like all the time. On the other hand, I do like searching for new stuff, as I said, which naturally makes CurseForge my place to go for discoverability. The biggest downside, honestly, is the reputation that they can't seem to shake off. But since the bad rep is centered mostly on the Overwolf client and CurseForge is going standalone, my opinion, they're both pretty safe with their strengths and weaknesses, but I leave you to make your own choice, including neither. Links to the clients for both Wowup and CurseForge are in the video description. You just need to scroll down in the Curse page and download the CurseForge Alpha on their download page. Otherwise, you'll get the whole big giant thing. Now let's go back to this week's PTR. Apart from the very needed Tabard fix, the Season 4 fix, Shrouded, is now available for testing. And the impression I have of this is that it's really soft, maybe underwhelming compared to the Season 3 affix Encrypted. Now what makes Encrypted cool is the woe buff that shrouds your team and makes you like super fast because it really changes up the gameplay. Like, you can do massive skips and on bosses take considerably less damage and dodge mechanics pretty easily. I know that's not the most popular buff to activate, but it is very different. Shrouded, in Season 4, it lets you choose a secondary stat from a broker person, and every time you find and defeat a Dreadlord, and they're scattered throughout the dungeon, you're going to get a small increase to that chosen stat. And that's pretty much it. According to some tests, that equates to an additional 20 or so % of one secondary towards the end of your dungeon, so slightly empowered mobs for more secondary stats, and you're not really going to feel it until you're getting close to the end. It's a little bit too boring for my taste, and it leaves a not so great impression for Mythic Plus in the future during Dragonflight, when we jump into an entirely new rotation of dungeons from season to season. I guess I just don't want the WoW team to make wimpy season affixes, because we're gonna get mad about learning new routes and strategies with each season. But here's what would be a little bit cooler, in this affix at least. So how about, like, when we beat up the Dreadlord, we get a big increase to our secondary stats, but it decays over a period of time. Like, not a big drop off, but something gradual, like 20 or 30 seconds. What that does is at least try to encourage some more frantic gameplay, as if we're trying to maintain a kill streak, I guess. And once those 20 or 30 seconds are over, we're going to retain that stacking buff as originally mentioned, so by the time we do get to that last boss, we have increased stats kind of more permanently. Or better yet, we drag a Dreadlord or two to that last boss, we kill the Dreadlord during the encounter, pop Bloodlust, and just go nuts. So I'm just kind of throwing dumb ideas out there. I don't do dungeon testing, so I don't know how that's going to work out, but I'd like to hear your thoughts too. Now, I might say this a couple of times through this next section, but even though testing on Mythic Keystones only started this week, Season 4 isn't going to be for at least a few months or so. Although the files and data that we're looking at now, it's going to be part of the 9.25 patch, which is coming somewhere in the future. Some are predicting 925 is going to drop very soon because outside of the big 3 content, we're pretty much ready to go, right? We're ready to move on to some new story and transmog and satisfying our impatience so we can immediately be impatient for the next thing. I think I came off with some douchebag energy earlier though, after Mr. GM threw out a question if the patch could drop as soon as the 31st of this month, and I was like, nah brah, let me spout some knowledge. But I want to elaborate here, so you folks at home and elsewhere can eviscerate me here in my own house. There are reasons why I don't think the patch is going to come until late June, like a month from now, and I've shared why in earlier statements. Like, basically, it's too short of a test cycle. A patch of this type would typically need its 3-month test cycle. Whenever 925 drops, we'll still be on Season 3, plus a few enhancements like weapons turning into upgradable cipher pieces from Zereth Mortis. Cross-faction is going to be a thing because hopefully cross-realm will be enabled by then. Alliance is at 14 guilds in the Hall of Fame now. I think they can do it. Even if Season 4 might be a few months off, it seems painfully clear that the WoW team is at least trying to cram everything in 9.2.5, and they don't intend to release a new patch until 10.0, which won't be until like next year. They just want to go all in on Dragonflight once this patch goes live, throw like a timer of sorts on Season 4, and then when the timer's up, servers go down, a reset happens, and ta-da, here we go. Somewhere in the WoW game files, whether it's the upcoming patch or even earlier patches, is various encrypted data. Maybe pre-order bonuses for Dragonflight, a 6-month promotional thing, the 18-month anniversary Brutosaur mount, who knows? It's stuff that we're going to see in the future that we just don't know about yet. But here's what we so far have not seen, or tested, or even data mined. There's no way to get rank 8 legendaries, or if that's even going to be a thing. Perhaps the WoW team wants our legendaries to stay as they are, meaning that they're going to have the same item level as the fated heroic raids. There are no new profession recipes to help freshly level alts. Meanwhile, normal max level dungeons, when Season 4 starts at least, will drop gear with an item level of 233, while mythic zeros will start dropping 262s. The requirement to queue up for said dungeons is like 140 or so, I mean, that's a very nice bump in gear, right? Fated Raid Finder difficulty has an item level requirement of 240, which is perfectly reasonable and drops item level 265 pieces. The point isn't that world content is being totally ignored, I'm just not ready to make that judgment yet, not fully. I'm just trying to demonstrate why I don't think all the parts of Season 4 are in the PTR, and I doubt info like this is being encrypted. So I imagine bits of information, little details like this are things that we're going to see before this patch goes live. We can discuss why maybe higher item levels from, say, ciphers from the first ones aren't a good fit. We can debate why maybe legendary gear won't and shouldn't be upgraded. But from my observations, I'm of the opinion that 925 is just not in a ready state. Like, for example, the item level requirements to queue up for normal and heroic dungeons, as I mentioned, it hasn't been changed in the PTR at all. Comparing normal dungeons between the live version and the PTR version of these dungeons, there's no difference in mob HP values. But on heroic, and especially mythic, there's a pretty big jump in stats that reflect the season change. Meanwhile, the dungeon journal on the PTR reflects Season 4 loot tables in almost their entirety. So if the item level requirements in dungeons haven't changed, some but not all the difficulty differences have changed, and all the loot tables have changed, that makes for a very odd gameplay experience, and I don't think that's intention. There's just no good conclusion to come up with other than that, well, they're not done setting everything up yet, and that's not a big deal at all. Real talk, this is one of the many side effects of data mining, in that there's a story to be told with what we see, as well as what we don't see. So I admit that reporting like this can be pretty annoying, but my headcanon, my copium, says that there's more to come. It won't be much, it's just some polish to try and give a consistent experience for this final season of Shadowlands. There are things that I would love to see too, so let's kind of move to that subject. First, let's go over some consistency. On the PTR, the estimated equipped item level difference between a solo or world content player compared to a big 3 player is massive. In Season 4, there will be elevated item level rewards from the world bosses, but only when that raid is active. So let me just kind of break it down. When Castle Nathria is available, it would be any of the 4 original world bosses that give this elevated item level. When Sanctum of Domination is up, it's Morgath, and when the Sepulchre of the First One's raid is up, then it's Antros, I believe. Right now, the loot tables don't seem to reflect on the PTR, so again, patch not ready. But going back to item level, in Zereth Mortis during patch 925, weapons are now going to be treated like Cypher gear and can be upgraded to 252s. But that's it. That's all it is for gear. So for players who don't raid, don't do dungeons, don't do PvP, their item level increases are limited to 1 world boss kill per week, which is pretty miserable. Compare this to the big 3 who are getting all sorts of opportunities. It makes the last big challenge of Shadowlands, the Jailer's Gauntlet, still pretty impossible to do for a solo player. It makes this kind of content, it makes these kinds of players feel less important. And I'm certain that's not the intention, but the reality says otherwise. I have a few bad, like really bad ideas to give world content at least some feel of progression. First though, a quick call to action for you, viewers. There are going to be folks in the comments asking, hey, why is more item level needed for you folks who don't do any of this group content? Or why do solo players need more things to do, period? So I encourage people, if they feel so inclined, to share why that is important to them. And I encourage others to not argue with them or to fight them or to dismiss them, but to just listen and try to understand where they're coming from. So anyway, let's start with professions. Very reckless idea here. Remember, everything here is bad, but how about all the Shadowlands profession recipes just get bumped up by like 30 item levels baseline? So from the greens to the blues to the legendary base pieces, just bump all of those things up from the bottom. That way nothing new needs to be learned. There's no time gating. There's no new materials. It's just increased production for people who need some early pieces to get by. There's no new raid or a new race to world first, so I predict, this might be a bad prediction too, but I predict that there won't be an immediate need to make item level 300 something or other legendaries. Another workaround for legendaries perhaps would be like a way for players to bypass professions altogether and upgrade rank 7s to a rank 8 with an item bought from an NPC. Or even heck, just use the creation catalyst. That should minimize the need to learn a new thing just to get our legendaries up to speed. And for crafters, nothing's really going to change either way. Next, let's have Cypher gear have higher upgrade levels that use Ciphers of the First Ones or Cosmic Flux, all the way up to a maximum item level of 278. That's gonna more or less kind of match the consistency of Season 3 gearing. Now, if that sounds a bit too heavy-handed, let's try to gate it just a little bit with the Creation Catalyst again. Like, allow only a few of these upgrades at a time with charges that are earned globally. Also, I guess make Cypher gear eligible to be turned into the class set pieces. So, hey, goodbye Sandworn gear. And for simplicity's sake, let's make the appearance of those of that gear be the same as normal difficulty Sepulchre gear, since we've done the whole Sandworn gear thing already, and just call it a day. The upgrades and transformation costs should be cheap enough to feel accessible for fresh players, but expensive enough to not step on the toes of big 3 players who, by the way, are going to get access to best in slot max item level weapons and trinkets for just showing up to raids as easy as Raid Finder. There's a lot of easy gear coming our way. If some folks dabble in group content too, I don't see how this is like the worst thing ever in the 4th season. As it is now, solo players outside of maybe pet classes have pretty much no chance at clearing the Jailer's Gauntlet at a very high level. That's the toughest, but still the most accessible solo content in Shadowlands. I'm not looking for a guaranteed win, just a shot to make it to the top. Horrific Visions in patch 8.3, it gave that opportunity in a very closed loop. I think that somehow Shadowlands is able to, or I guess they ought to give that chance at some fulfillment. Now, item level means a lot. I've mostly been talking about that. However, Season 4 shouldn't just be about player power, just like how it shouldn't be just about the big 3. The WoW team is pushing for Dragonflight to adopt this new philosophy that does away with needless repetition by acknowledging our accomplishments account-wide, not having to repeat the same mundane stuff over and over again. I don't think we should have to wait that long for something like that. I think the perfect opportunity is presenting itself right now. I think it's time to let people buy appearances from the Covenant Sanctum vendors, even if the armor or the weapon type doesn't match the character. Now, some don't come from vendors, I get that, and ideally, these should still be earnable on a single character, whether it's me waiting for Unity gear for like forever, or if I complete one set, then I should be able to like buy the rest or something like that. Account-wide Sanctum upgrades is a little bit less ideal, but it would still go a long way too. I've said not too long ago that I'm not very sympathetic over the grind for appearances because it's not player power, it's just appearances. I'm pretty close to finishing collecting everything I could on a single character, my main, which does cover a lot. But after seeing what it took this first time, and knowing that the WoW team is changing their own tone in Dragonflight, my own tone has shifted as well. It's crazy. Content creator changes mind. React video in an upcoming stream. I think this is a great opportunity to unload the burden of leveling 3 more complete sets of Sanctum content with the campaigns and the Ember Courts and the Paths of Ascensions and the conservatories and the stitching factories and the mirror repairs and the Unity collections. The anima, I'm fine with, alright? The Grateful Offerings, I know how to farm that pretty efficiently, I'm not worried about that, but dealing with Sanctum upgrades and Stitchmaster rep again, I think that's unnecessary as we do this whole paradigm shift. I think that there's a fair way. I just hope that 925 in Season 4 has a lot to give for all players, because presently, there's a big audience that seems to have been left out. That's the show, and Anduin is still alive, rocking his theme song, dun 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 dun, whatever, rocking that song while the Horde is laid low. But I have a plan. It's a good one, and I'll tell you about it once he's dead. It's a secret plan, and it is 100% litigation proof. I want to thank the fantastic people over on Twitch for the support, and I request their forgiveness. I was out of it Thursday, so I could give you today's amazing performance. A big thanks to our patrons, including Nathan and serial newcomer Deborah. I think she purposely signs back up just so I can give her a shout out, so hi again and thank you. And to you, viewer, for making it to the end, thank you as well. I hope you enjoyed today's awkward energy, and I'd love to see you come back. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, maybe consider your Patreon supports, but otherwise, I'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.